The silence was the cruelest thing. It had descended hours ago, a thick, suffocating blanket heavier than the canvas sheet she had draped over Mama's still form. Alara sat on the splintered buckboard of the wagon, one wheel shattered against a rock, the axle bent into a grimace. The vast, bleached sky offered no comfort, only the relentless glare of a sun that baked the cracked earth and stole the moisture from her lips. Beside her, her younger brother, Leo, had finally cried himself to sleep, his small body curled against her side, his tear-streaked face slack with an exhaustion that mirrored her own. Mama passed this morning. The words were a stone in her throat, a simple, horrifying fact that had undone their world. The fever had taken her swiftly, leaving behind only this hollow quiet and the buzzing of indifferent flies. They were adrift in an ocean of prairie grass, the promise of a new life in the Oregon territories now just a bitter taste on her tongue, mingling with the dust. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of judgment, a hissing reminder of their failure, their foolishness. They had nothing, less than nothing. The last of the water was gone, the hardtack was dwindling, and hope had bled out into the dust with the last of Mama's warmth. Fear, a cold and sharp thing, had moved into the space vacated by grief. It was a more practical emotion, she thought. Grief was a luxury. Fear was a spur. But a spur to do what? To go where? There was nowhere. They were an island of despair in a sea of unforgiving land. It was then that she saw him, a rider, emerging from the shimmering heat haze like a mirage, a dark figure against the horizon. At first, she felt a surge of impossible hope, but it soured as he drew closer. He was not a savior from a storybook. He was carved from the same harsh landscape that surrounded them. His face weathered leather, his eyes narrowed against the sun and, it seemed, against the world itself. He rode a formidable black horse that moved with an unnerving economy of motion, and he stopped a dozen yards from their broken wagon, saying nothing. His gaze swept over the scene, the shattered wheel, the pathetic camp, the canvas-draped form. Alara's hand tightened on Leo's shoulder, pulling him closer. This was it. This was the end in a different guise. A scavenger, perhaps, or something worse. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of his saddle leather. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, solid. He walked not to her, but to the grave she had spent the morning digging, a shallow, desperate scrape in the hard-packed soil. He looked at it, then back at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no pity. They held only a flat, unsettling comprehension. Yours. His voice was low, rough like rocks grinding together. Alara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He gave a single, curt nod in return, as if a transaction had been completed. He looked at Leo, then at the empty water cask. Without another word, he turned, unstrapped a canteen from his saddle, and walked back to her. He didn't hand it to her. He set it on the buckboard beside her, a heavy, solid thud. An offering, or a test. She stared at it, then up at him, searching his face for some sign of his intent. There was nothing to read. He was a locked door. Drink, he commanded, the word not a suggestion. Her hands trembled as she uncorked it, the sound loud in the oppressive stillness. She gave the first precious sip to Leo, who stirred but did not wake, and then allowed herself a mouthful. It was cool, clean, life-giving. It was the first kindness she had known since the sun rose on her mother's death. The man watched her, his expression unchanging. He was waiting. For what? She did not know. For her to beg? To weep? To give up? She met his gaze, lifting her chin with a sliver of defiance she did not know she possessed. Her world was gone, but she was still here, and Leo was still here. That had to be enough. He led them to his ranch. There was no discussion, no choice offered. After helping her finish the burial, a task he undertook with a grim, silent efficiency that was more respectful than any empty platitude, he simply said, "Get your things." He loaded their meager trunk and the bedding onto his pack mule, hoisted a sleepy and bewildered Leo onto his own horse, and began to walk, leaving Alara to follow the slow, plodding pace of the mule. The ranch was less a home and more a fortress against the wilderness. The house was built of thick, dark timber and stone, with small, deep-set windows. A sturdy barn stood nearby, along with a web of corrals. It was a place of work, devoid of any softness. There was no garden, no porch swing, no sign of a woman's touch. It was the domain of a man who lived on his own terms, and those terms were harsh. He showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It was sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. It was also clean, the floor swept, the wool blanket on the bed neatly folded. "You and the boy," he said, and that was all. He left them, the sound of his boots receding down the hall. For days, an unspoken contract governed their existence. Alara rose before the sun, her grief a cold stone in her belly, and found work. She cleaned the small house until it shone, mended the rancher's coarse shirts with tiny, neat stitches Mama had taught her, and scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees. She did not know his name. He was simply the rancher, a silent, formidable presence. He ate the simple meals she prepared without comment, his eyes on his plate. Yet she noticed things. A pail of fresh milk, richer than any they'd ever had, left on the doorstep each morning. An extra loaf of bread on the counter after he returned from his weekly trip to the distant town. Small, unspoken provisions. He never addressed her directly unless necessary, his words clipped and functional. Fence needs mending, storms coming, but she watched him. She saw the way he gentled the skittish colt in the corral, his rough hands surprisingly patient. She saw him stand for long minutes staring out at the land, his shoulders set against the wind, a solitary figure who seemed both master of this place and its prisoner. A fragile trust, thin as a spider's thread, began to weave itself in the silence. Leo, after the initial shock, started to heal. The rancher, whose name they learned was Silas, began giving him small tasks. He taught the boy how to properly stack firewood, how to check the chicken coop for eggs, how to brush down a horse. He never spoke to Leo with anything resembling tenderness, yet the boy flourished under the man's steady, quiet attention. For the first time in his life, Leo felt useful, a part of something larger than himself. One afternoon, Silas returned from town and placed a small parcel wrapped in brown paper on the kitchen table. Inside were 2 pairs of sturdy shoes, one for her and one for Leo. He said nothing of it, turning to fill the water basin to wash the dust from his face. Alara looked at her own worn-out boots, the soles nearly gone. Gratitude swelled in her chest, so fierce and painful it felt like another form of grief. She wanted to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. They felt too small for the gesture. Later that week, a wagon rattled up the long track to the house. It was Mr. Davies, the proprietor from the general store in town, a man with a sour face and eyes that missed nothing. He appraised her with a look of open disapproval. "Silas," he called out, not bothering to dismount. "Sheriff asked me to check. Heard you'd picked up strays." Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood between the wagon and the house, a silent barrier. "They're no trouble," he said, his voice flat. "Trouble finds folk like that," Davies sneered, nodding toward Alara. "Orphans belong in the county home. It's the proper way. The decent way." The word orphan struck Alara like a slap. It was a label, a brand, marking them as burdens. She saw the future Davies was painting for them. A sterile institution, Leo taken from her, their bond severed forever. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. Silas didn't answer. He simply stared at the man until Davies grew uncomfortable, tugging at his collar before turning his wagon around with a frustrated flick of the reins. As he left, Alara met Silas's gaze across the yard. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a flicker of shared defiance. He had defended them in his own way, with his silence, with his unmovable presence. The thread of trust grew a little stronger. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with a tension that mirrored Alara's own. The confrontation with Mr. Davies had left a residue of fear, a constant awareness of how precarious their situation was. They were living on borrowed time, sheltered by a man the world saw as strange and reclusive. The town's judgment felt like a physical presence, waiting just beyond the borders of the ranch. The storm broke just after dusk. It was not a cleansing rain, but a violent assault. Wind tore at the house, shrieking through the eaves like a vengeful spirit. Rain came down in solid, horizontal sheets that hammered against the small window panes. Then came the hail, stones of ice that clattered against the roof with the sound of 1,000 thrown rocks. Leo, pale and wide-eyed, sat close to the hearth, where a fire sputtered and spat. Alara watched the window, her hands clenched in her lap. Through the maelstrom, she saw the flicker of Silas's lantern out by the corrals. He was out there trying to get the horses into the relative safety of the barn. Suddenly, a sound ripped through the din of the storm. A sharp crack of splintering would followed by the terrified screaming of a horse. Alara's heart seized. Without a second thought, she grabbed a heavy wool blanket from her trunk and threw it over her head, plunging out into the tempest. The wind nearly knocked her from her feet. Icy rain and hail stung her face, and the world was a roaring chaos of wind and darkness, lit only by strobing flashes of lightning. She saw it in the next flash. A section of the corral fence had been shattered, likely by a lightning strike on the post. One of the young mares, panicked and wild-eyed, had bolted. Silas was trying to head her off, but the horse was crazed with fear, slipping and scrambling on the muddy, hail-covered ground. He was going to be trampled. "Silas!" she screamed, but the wind swallowed her voice. She ran, her skirts heavy with mud, the blanket clutched in her hand. She remembered something her father had told her, a lifetime ago, about cornered animals needing an escape they could see. She ran not at the horse, but in a wide arc, placing herself between the terrified animal and the open prairie. She held the blanket out wide, making herself as large as she could. In the next flash of lightning, the mare saw her, a strange, flapping shape that was not the enclosing fence or the pursuing man. The horse shied, turning back toward the barn, its instinct for shelter overriding its panic. Silas was there in an instant, grabbing its halter, his voice a low, calming rumble that somehow cut through the storm's fury. He led the trembling animal into the barn's open doors. Alara stood, drenched and shivering, the blanket heavy and useless in her hands. He came back for her, his face grim in the lantern light. He took her arm, his grip firm, and pulled her toward the house. Inside, the warmth was a shock. He pushed her into a chair by the fire and stripped the sodden blanket from her shoulders. He disappeared and returned with a tin mug of something hot and laced with whiskey. He pressed it into her trembling hands. "Fool thing to do," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual. He was angry, or something else. He stood before the fire, his back to her, water dripping from his hair and clothes onto the stone hearth. "She would have run," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Or she would have trampled you." He turned then, and his eyes held an emotion she had never seen in him before. It was a raw, unguarded thing, a mixture of shock and something that looked terrifyingly like fear, not for himself but for her. The silence in the room was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the storm outside and the unspoken thing that had just passed between them. She had not acted out of obligation or a desire to earn her keep. She had acted to protect him, and he knew it. In that moment, the foundation of their arrangement shifted from one of necessity to one of connection, forged not in words, but in the heart of a storm. The aftermath of the storm was a world washed clean. The sun rose into a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue, glistening on a landscape of wet earth and shattered branches. The air was cool and smelled of rain and pine. The violence of the night had passed, leaving behind a profound and ringing peace. Alara and Silas worked together that morning, clearing debris and repairing the broken corral fence. They moved in a comfortable, practiced rhythm, the silence between them no longer a void but a shared space. Leo, tasked with gathering smaller fallen branches for kindling, worked with a cheerful diligence. his fear of the storm forgotten in the morning's purpose. Mr. Davies did not return. The sheriff never came. The threat from the town seemed to have receded, diminished by the greater power of the storm and by the quiet solidity of the life they were building. That evening, as the sun bled orange and pink across the western horizon, Alara found Silas by the edge of the bluff that overlooked the vast expanse of his land. He was not mending a fence or tending to an animal. He was simply watching the sky, a rare moment of stillness. She stood a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude, but he turned his head as if he had sensed her presence. "The land is hard," he said, his voice quiet, conversational. It was the most he had ever offered without prompting. "It takes more than it gives, most times." She looked out at the rolling hills and shadowed ravines. She remembered her first sight of this place, how alien and hostile it had felt. Now she saw the subtle shades of green and brown, the way the light caught on the creek in the distance, the sturdy, rooted presence of the trees. It was still a hard land, but it was no longer an enemy. "Mama used to say you have to plant your feet where you stand," she replied, the memory bringing a dull ache, but not the sharp agony it once had. "That you can't live your life always looking for the next place." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The last sliver of sun disappeared, and the first stars began to prick the deepening indigo of the sky. He had given them shelter, then safety. He had given her brother a purpose and her a place to heal. She had come here as a beggar, a stray, stripped of everything. But standing here now, she felt a strength in her own limbs, a stillness in her own heart. She was no longer just surviving. "Mr. Davies was wrong," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "This isn't a place for orphans." He finally turned to look at her, his face softened by the twilight. A deep line was etched between his brows, a look of contemplation. "When I found you," he began, his voice low and measured, "you told me you had nowhere to go." The memory of that day was vivid. The heat, the despair, the terrifying silence of her mother's death. She nodded, her throat tightening at the recollection of her absolute hopelessness. She looked at him, bracing herself for the question she always dreaded, the one that asked what she would do now, where she would go next. But it never came. Instead, his words, simple and profound, landed in the quiet air between them, settling not just in her ears, but in the very marrow of her bones. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and held the weight of an unshakable truth. "You're already home." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. It was a foundation laid, a root taking hold in the hard, unforgiving soil. Alara looked away from him, out at the vast, star-dusted land stretching into the darkness. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of grief or fear. It was a tear of release. The wind picked up, cool and clean against her skin, and for the first time it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise.